Another addition to Level Up. This is a review of Level Up Trials and Treasures. Let's dive in. And here we have Level Up, Advanced 5th Edition, Trials and Treasures. Let's take a quick look at the back. Journeys, treasure, and mystery await. This essential rulebook for Level Up Advanced 5th Edition contains the full journey and exploration rules of the game, including details on regions, discoveries, and boons, dozens of exploration challenges, and rules for random encounters of all types. Not only that, Trials and Treasures also contains over 500 magic items and rules for crafting them, from fantastically powerful artifacts to minor enchanted trinkets, and pages of advice and tools for creating encounters and running the game. I am so thankful, and I actually did forget to point this out, but even the Adventurer's Guide had 2 of these bookmarked ribbons, and Trials and Treasures has 2 of them as well. And I believe the Monstrous Menagerie also has 2, which we will check out someday. The inside has the table of contents, of which there is a major typo in my copy of this book. So we can see here that we have Chapter 5, Exploration Challenges, Chapter 6, Maladies, Chapter 6 also, Adventuring Rewards, Chapter 6 again, Enchanted Gear, and then the appendices. This is actually corrected later on when you actually get to the actual chapters, but I just thought it would be worth pointing out that I did get this off of Kickstarter, and there are some errors and stuff in there, which, oh well, I mean, there's bound to be some of that as well. So, if the Adventurer's Guide was the player's handbook, then Trials and Treasures is the Dungeon Master's Guide. This is a book reserved to help the narrator run the game, and it does that quite fantastically. I would say this book is separated into 2 different parts. The first helps the narrator kind of flesh out their world from the actual world itself, the encounters and exploration challenges, and even the diseases thrown in for good measure. And the last half of the book is where you're going to find your magic items and your adventure rewards. The appendices from the Adventurer's Guide is actually the same, and you know what? I am all for that. It's actual helpful information, and it just prevents me from having to grab that big, heavy tome to the table and flipping all the way to the back of the book, when I can just have one book here for things that I need, and the conditions and I'm mainly going to use it for the conditions, but it's back there and I can just flip back there, and it's exactly the same layout and the same information. So kudos to them for taking that approach. So just like with any type of a book, there's bound to be an introduction, and we're actually going to skip the introduction this time around because a lot of the same information that is presented here is also in the Adventurer's Guide, which I've already covered. Things like ability scores and dice rolling are all the same, and instead of from the perspective of the player, you have from the perspective of the narrator, and what is the narrator, and what is your job as the narrator and stuff like that. So we're actually going to skip on down to Chapter 1, Gamemastery Troubleshooting. Like many sections on how to game master, this chapter is for people who are new to leading a game, whether it is Level Up or some other game. And the information is actually well thought out, but at the same time is just kind of piggybacking off of what the DMG or the Dungeon Master's Guide has already put out. And as I read through these Level Up books, I am reminded of a saying that I kept coming back to. It's just more stuff. It's not doing anything new just quite yet. This chapter opens up with the player archetypes, which we got in the Know Your Player section in the DMG, and I find it rather funny that they get all deep and analytical with these archetypes by offering potential difficulties and dealing with these players. And I'm sure there is some validity to these statements, but just remember, every human person is different, and players' needs can shift from session to session. Also, I just cannot get over this picture right here. Like, it's really goofy to me for some reason. I mean, like, is she boogieing down with this orc or something? It looks like she's in the middle of, like, some sort of a dance. I do like how this book does expand on some potential problems that can come up in your game sessions, like what do you do if your players turn into murder hobos, or what do you do when somebody is taking the spotlight a little bit too much. The last part of this chapter deals with role-playing safety tools, and without getting too much into it, because everyone has their own opinions on the subject, there are different ways of just glossing over certain themes and actions in your game so as not to trigger individuals, and they tend to cover all of it. When you really get down to it, though, it's always best to have a session zero, and they do explain that and how to best approach a session zero, and like what kind of topics you should cover before you actually go into your first session with your players. And this ensures that you and the rest of your players are on the same page as in terms of the game that you want to run and that they want to play in. So without further ado, let's get into Chapter 2, World Building. Like Chapter 1 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, the world building chapter of Level Up goes over certain principles to help flesh out the world you build with or for your players. So when you get into your session zero, you're going to want to inform or come to an understanding with your players the type of game that you're running. So where do the adventurers fit in? What are the conflicts? What is the scope? And most importantly, what is the tone of the game? So if you've never built a campaign from scratch, then the section on plot structure is fairly decent, worthy of a read. Although quite honestly, I really like how Stargate SG-1 RPG explains this the best. Instead of acts, there are seasons, and just like in a television show, and each season has so many episodes to pace things out. The information is very much the same here, just not so eloquently put. I will say that this chapter does give you some things to think about in terms of how you create your world. There are a series of questions that help you fill out things like how prevalent are myths in my world and what is the tech level of your world. The last part of this chapter is all about the planes, and I'm not so big of a fan of this particular section because it is just a very basic cut and paste version of, the planes or the multiverse. This probably serves Level Up's own setting, but I think for a chapter that is about developing and creating your own world, I think this would have served better as an example, which, I mean, quite honestly, this could be an example for all I know. It would have been nice to see options for, or some sort of a guide on creating your own multiverse, or whatever you want to call it. But in this respect, I do think the Dungeon Master's Guide kind of does a little bit better of a job in presenting their version of the multiverse or their planes. But you do get things like, the elemental planes and the ethereal planes, or whatever they call it here, the dreaming, the waking, and the bleak gates. You have this far realm and the gyre here that's also explained. And also how planets kind of fit into things, but not really. It's not my favorite, put honestly, for a fantasy game. So we'll move on to Chapter 3, Encounter Design. At the very beginning of the chapter, you have an explanation on challenge ratings. Challenges are separated into 3 different categories: social, exploration, and combat. Nothing new there. And to me, though, Level Up really steps things up from Dungeons & Dragons. It tries to ease the horrors of the 5e challenging system by offering 5 different tiers of difficulty, from easy to impossible. Just like in Dungeons & Dragons a little bit, but they kind of further add more tiers or something like that. So it works very similar to what's in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So you're still going to have to do some math to get the numbers just right, but make no mistake, these difficulties are not set in stone. You may play with people who really take to combat tactics or have a party composition that stomps all over but the hardiest of monsters. So you can bump them up to the next tier. So we have easy, medium, hard, deadly, and impossible matchups. So maybe that they stomp all over media matchups, and you want to you want something to be the norm. So you could make hard matchups the norm, and then deadly matchups a challenge, and impossible matchups a deadlier challenge than that. So you can kind of tweak things out like that. And I do like how they just lay this out for you. Like, it's not just paragraphs of paragraphs. They actually use bullet points, and it's very easy to read. There's also some guidelines on how many encounters a day that the party should be able to handle, which I thought was very interesting. So, as a rule of thumb for how many battles a party can likely handle before it needs a long rest, use a daily budget of encounter points. And so the encounter points, so let's say that they're between first and second level, they're at tier 0. That means they have 1 encounter point. And then at tier 1, have 2. Second tier, they have 4. At third tier, they have 6. And at the fourth tier, from 17th level to 20th level, they have 8 encounter points. And depending on how difficulty you want that fight, you're spending those encounter points from their reserve. And that's like a very light way of keeping track of what their resources are, if they are average at managing those resources and things like that. Now, I should mention that I am no expert when it comes to running Dungeons & Dragons, so I do not have a ton of experience in designing my own encounters, and I certainly don't have enough experience with Level Up to definitively say that, yes, this is much better than what's in Dungeons & Dragons, so take that with a grain of salt. The last part of this chapter is about the encounter elements. So let's say you want to make the encounter more challenging, you can add any of these elements to give your combat encounters more flair and difficulty. And some of these are in the DMG, like the brown mold. And in fact, some of the encounter elements that we do have are things like acid, brown mold, crowds, darkness, dense smoke, extreme cold, extreme heat, falling, fire, frigid water, green slime, heavy precipitation, high gravity, lava, low gravity, magnetized ore, memory crystals, mirroring ground, poisonous plants, rushing liquid, strong winds, underwater vacuum webs, and then yellow mold. And they are all explained here with their saving throws and their difficulties, because each one of these either increases or lowers the CR of that specific encounter. So it's very interesting concepts. And I really do like the idea of, not just having a typical encounter, because that tends to be very boring all the time. You want something memorable for your players, something fantastical. And I think this is a way of really upping the ante and making those types of battles, even if it's just against, those mundane kobolds, a little bit more interesting. So let's take a look at Chapter 4, Exploration. Now, this chapter, as well as the next, are some of my favorite chapters in the Level Up system, period. Chapter 4 is all about exploration and everything that entails. So you get your basic rules like travel pace and forced march, traveling with mounts, but also tracking supply, which I kind of didn't cover in my review of the Adventurer's Guide. Simply put, supply is what you attribute your rations to. So one supply consists of enough food and water to sustain a creature, medium and small, for 1 day. If you're large, then you have to consume 2 rations or supplies. Whenever you take a long rest, you must consume supply. If you do not, you gain a level of fatigue. And honestly, I would have taken this a step further by saying that you cannot heal normally unless you consume supply. But I guess I'm kind of a masochist like that, so be glad I don't really run Dungeons & Dragons anymore. Let's say that you want to get from point A to point B. As a good narrator, you'll probably have some sort of a map on display, hopefully with a hexagonal grid. As your PCs go on their merry way, they have different activities that can be performed. And so they have things like befriend an animal or busk, chronicle. They can cook. They can cover tracks, entertain, gather components. They can gossip, harvest, hunt and gather, prey, rob people. They can scout and track. All these different things that that you might expect to do on your journey. There's actually rules here, and different roles that you can perform, but they also describe what happens if you get a critical failure, what happens if you get a critical success, and things like that. And there are some more errors in this chapter that I've noticed than any of the other chapters, specifically with the boldings. So, like, success here should be in bold, but it's not, and things like that. And it's not consistent, so would have been nice if somebody had actually looked at that once again and noticed things like that and fixed it before, going off to the printing press. The greatest portion of this chapter is about the different regions. You can, of course, create your own region, and there are guidelines for doing so after the region section, but a majority of the regions presented here are generic enough where you can use it as is, and it fits just fine. So each of the different regions has listed the type of terrain common, the tiers that you can use this for. Like, if you have higher level players, then you might have this type of a region called the Blasted Badlands, which is tended to be tier 2 and above. So it's not odd or out of place if you have, characters that fit those certain levels. Although it might be a little awkward if you are playing with tier 0 players and they come across Blasted Badlands. But there are options for that too. Each of the different regions goes from tier 0 all the way up to tier 4. Then there's the different weather conditions that you might come to expect in this specific region, as well as any special rulings for journey activities. For example, the Blasted Badlands has adventurers gain advantage on checks made to scout, but disadvantage on checks made to befriend animal, gossip, and rob. It is not possible to busk, harvest, or hunt and gather. So there are different types of rulings for that for each of the different regions, and there's quite a few number of regions. So you have things like the Blasted Badlands, the Country Shire, the Feywood, the Fiery Hellscape, the Flowing River, the Frozen Wastes, the Haunted Lands, Lofty Mountains, Open Roads, Parched Sands, Restless Sea, Rolling Grasslands, Tangled Forest, Underland Realm, Unrelenting Marsh, Urban Township, War-Torn Kingdom, and that is it. Of course, the terrain is only a portion of what your players will be traversing. Sometimes they'll delve into dungeons, and there's a pseudo-dungeon exploration thing going on here too, but I'm less excited about that than the actual regions. And there's plenty of dungeon maps and dungeon adventures floating out there, so just choose one, quite honestly. Next are the social encounters, which can be rolled on in some of the region tables. These are simple, brief happenings along the journey that can be expanded upon, but to me, these are just little bits of flavorings to add to your player's dinner, or maybe it's lunch or dessert. Last is the travel scenery. So once again, sometimes you might roll one of these on your actual roll for the region, or be asked to roll on here. And they are just one sentence descriptors of things that you might come across your journey, and the descriptions seem generic enough to work with in just about any region. Like, for example, a flock of birds wheels and dives in the air, staying within sight for most of the day, or a stone circle, some remnant of an ancient religion, and there's 100 of them, quite literally. So anyways, let's move on to Chapter 5, Exploration Challenges. Aside from the combat encounters you may come across when you roll on the region table, you may also come across exploration challenges. Of course, you can always choose to go the long way around instead of encountering the challenge, unless you happen to be going in a very linear path for some reason, like maybe going through a really wide valley or something like that, and the only way forward is forward. Like in one of those Shannara books, I think it was like the very first one, they go through like a valley and they have to keep their eyes closed or something like that, which is actually a pretty cool idea now that I think about it. But doing so, taking the long way around, that is, quadruples the time of the encounter being circumvented. So just keep that in mind. It does take a while to go back the way you came and go around. There are many challenges in this chapter, and just like the journey activities from the previous chapter, you get effects for critical failures on up to critical successes underneath the possible solutions. Let's take the acid field as an example here. This is a challenge 8 for second tier terrains, DC 1715. The area is local or 1 hour. So strange black spots mar the sparse ground ahead. After a few moments of observation, it's clear why. Acidic fluid erupts from fissures in the ground. Acidic spray. Every half hour spent traveling in this area, a corrosive geyser explodes near the party, sending acid in a 60-foot radius. Each creature in the area makes a dexterity saving throw, taking 7 or 2d6 acid damage on a failure. Nature. A nature check reveals to the party that their supply is vulnerable to the corrosive atmosphere. Protecting provisions. An engineering check, or a check made with tools the narrator deems appropriate, allows each adventurer to adequately protect any supply they are carrying. This check must be made before the supply is destroyed. In addition to that, things like that, you have a possible solution. So a group survival check is made to adequately protect the adventurers and safely traverse the area. On a critical failure, the party loses 2 or 2d4 plus 1 supply to the corrosive atmosphere, and each adventurer suffers a level of fatigue from acid burns. On a failure, the party loses 2 supply to the corrosive atmosphere, and any adventurer that failed their checks suffer a level of fatigue from acid burns. A success, the adventurers make it through the area successfully. On a critical success, the adventurers make it through the area successfully, and they notice something important. Roll on the boons and discoveries table, which is later on in the adventuring rewards chapter. So every single one of these exploration challenges brings something unique and fantastical to your game. And I'm reading through Sly Flourish's The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide, and I'm reminded of being prepared and, just having things and tools and stuff like that. This chapter and the previous are tools that I would take and I would keep and hug it and just crush it with my little arms and just cherish and use every time with any fantasy game that I have that is a bit of an open world or maybe sandbox type. I would use this because all of these ideas are very detailed and they actually work and they're actually really cool. You can also tell that a lot of love went into this and the previous chapter because just the amount of options and the mechanics within some of these challenges are really impressive. Even if your game of choice for a fantasy style game is not going to be level up, these 2 chapters I think are worth it. And I kind of really wish they had just those 2 chapters in like some sort of a PDF that you could purchase separately. But I really do like these 2 chapters and they add a lot to the game. For now, let us take a look at Chapter 6, Maladies. Diseases and Poisons is the name of the game for this chapter. Each disease has a description of what happens when you contract said disease, any lingering effects, and how to cure it, but it's usually with some sort of a restoration spell. The diseases are separated into the different tiers of play and actually provide a lot of variety if you decide to include them. For example, trollpox, where you at? This virulent disease originated in trolls but has since spread to other creatures. Trollpox manifests as an outbreak of boils that are rapidly replaced by tumorous growths. Whenever a creature infected with trollpox takes bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, each living creature within 5 feet of it makes a DC 17 Constitution saving throw or becomes infected. After 1d4 hours, an infected creature's skin erupts with boils. Though unpleasant, the initial stage of trollpox is harmless to the victim. However, each time the creature finishes a long rest, it repeats the saving throw. On a failure, the boils burst to reveal a host of fast-growing tumors. The creature's hit points maximum is reduced by 5 or 1d10. Each time the creature fails a Constitution saving throw, its hit point maximum is reduced by an additional 5 or 1d10 points. The target dies if this effect reduces its point maximum to 0. In addition, the character gains the following trait: Regeneration. The creature regains 10 hit points at the start of its turn. If the creature takes acid or fire damage, this trait doesn't function at the start of its next turn. The creature dies only if it starts its turn with 0 hit points and doesn't regenerate. Infected creatures can live with trollpox for extended periods, but they never recover naturally. Only a greater restoration spell or similar magic can cure the disease. And then we get this section on poisons. Now, some poisons are cut from the same coin, and by that I mean some of the effects are similar to others. The most likely example are the poisons where if you fail your constitution saving throw, you are dealt poison damage of different lethality, like for example, the Naga Spit. This venomous substance slithers and burns through veins at a mere touch. The creature makes a DC 15 Constitution saving throw when subjected to this poison, taking 45 or 10d8 poison damage on a failure, or half as much damage on a success. And then we have Serpent Venom. The venom sacs of exotic serpents can be carefully extracted and repurposed. A creature that makes a DC 11 Constitution saving throw when it is subjected to this poison, taking 11 or 3d6 poison damage on a failure, or half as much damage on a success. It's just different tiers of poison, rather, for whatever level your characters happen to be on. That's pretty much the same deal for most of these poisons. There are some unique ones in there, but I don't know. I just kind of wish that the poisons did something cool like the diseases, but then again, it's poison and not a disease. So let's move on to Chapter 7, Adventuring Rewards. This chapter is primarily going to be used for its random treasures tables. The beginning of the chapter explains rewards and how to use them. It also explains experience points and the two different ways of giving experience, either for defeating monsters and other challenges. Although, I mean, that's really the only two ways, but they do kind of give others, like giving experience for over time, like for every other session, they gain so much experience or so many levels or something like that. But I don't know, it's like, would we really use it? Something that is rather interesting is this handy dandy chart of treasure by level. So if you're not sure what your players should get at what time, that is exactly what this table is for. This is broken down by level, and it's an average of what players should get per level. So at level 1, they should acquire 50 gold pieces, 60% magic items table, number 1 or 2, 35% magic items tables, numbers 4 through 6, and things like that. And it goes all the way up to level 20. A really interesting way of separating your loot, I guess, but I don't really see anybody using this verbatim. Then, of course, there's the random tables. And just like with the Dungeon Master's Guide, the tables themselves are split by level, and there are different categories such as treasure, gemstones, valuables, and magic items. While the magic items table are probably the most exciting, there are some additional tables. You might want to actually give a boon or something similar. Boons are different benefits that can be rewarded for a variety of reasons. You might decide to gift your players with an animal companion that helps or guides the players while they are out in the region, or a divine blessing from their deity or follower, or they come across some herbs and medicinals, or maybe some sort of a secret. I like this sort of new addition. The DMG did give boons in the form of blessings and charms, but in Level Up, you're given more variety to better tailor to your players' needs. And I really do like this attention to detail. It's actually really cool and interesting. For now, let us move on to Chapter 8, the Enchanted Gear. This is the exhaustive list of magical items, and the list of magical items goes all the way almost to the appendixes at the very back. So it's a very large list. Some of the items here are exactly as they were in the Dungeon Master's Guide. For example, the Amulet of Healing is exactly the same, as is the Ammunitions plus 1, 2, and 3. Some items, for the most part, are the same, but slightly different. Like the bag of beans. Let me see if I can find it. The bag of beans. Now, for the most part, it's exactly the same from the D100 list and their values and a lot of their effects, but I believe it's the 91 through 99 is the one that's different. I think in the DMG, it was like a pyramid sprouts up and it happens to be like a mummy lord's tomb or something like that. But here it's like a 5-foot hole with swirling multicolored vapors. And yeah, very interesting. A really weird change for that. And I kind of wonder why they did that, but oh well. So some of the items are slightly different. The Dungeon Master's Guide has around 400 magic items listed, if I'm not mistaken, in its magic items chapter. Level Up has around 500, as we've seen in the back of the book. And a lot of these, or some of the items listed here, are actually brand new. Like we had the Aegis, the Aegis Shield, or Aegis of the Eternal Moon is completely new. I couldn't find in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I don't know if it's any of the other publications because I haven't taken the time to actually look through them. But that is something that is different from the Dungeon Master's Guide at least. So what isn't in Level Up, I think can easily be pulled from the Dungeon Master's Guide and vice versa. Unless you get into very specific rulings, like maybe combat maneuvers or anything like that. Or, well, I guess supply could just be transitioned to rations. But I'm fairly confident that a majority of the items can work both ways. So more magic items if you're really interested in that. There is a section on sentient items and artifacts. Artifacts are uber powerful and you can't actually craft them. They're just set in the world. And the final section is about crafting. Crafting works the same way as it does in the Dungeon Master's Guide. One of the differences is that the player is required to make 2 rolls, one at the beginning and one at the end. And failing will often lead to half of the materials required being consumed, but if you fail by like more than 5 or 10, I think, all of the components are consumed. Crafting time is also no longer based on the cost of the item, but on its rarity, starting at 1 week. And then art or legendary items can go up to 25 plus 48 weeks. So quite a lengthy time there. This seems simple, like in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Although I kind of wish they had taken more of a Xanathar's approach with the inclusion of complications for failed rolls and things like that. Seems like they kind of went with the way they did, so the players and the GM involved don't really have to spend too much thought going over formulas and the like. It's simple. It's a simple get it done and get it over with kind of a system. And of course, that's very dependent on if you're playing or running a game that makes the time for players to actually engage in these kinds of activities. The last thing is the appendix, which, as I've stated at the beginning of the video, is the exact same thing that we got in the Adventurer's Guide. So we have the conditions and the compatibility blurb. So go back to that previous video if you really want to know what's up there. For now, let's go to my final thoughts. Trials and Treasures is obviously the Dungeon Master's Guide for Level Up, but I believe it to be better in some minor ways. First, the layout. So, as I've stated in the Adventurer's Guide, I really love the layout of Level Up a lot better than anything that, Dungeons & Dragons has put out recently. And it is the same here. Second is the content. The addition of the exploration and exploration challenges content makes this book well worth it, even if you weren't going to use it for Level Up. I kind of wish that those sections were in a PDF or a book on its own. Maybe it is. I'm going to have to take a look, but I highly doubt it. Does it do what it was designed to do? Yes, I think it does. It gives the narrator tools to make running the game seamless and easy. It also gives the materials to work with. I think the chapter on world building is a little underdone in some aspects, like the plane section, but it does provide the information that it needs to without complicating things. Would I recommend this? Yes, I think I would, if only for the chapters on encounters and exploration challenges. And quite honestly, I like this book a great deal more than I like the Adventurer's Guide because of the tools it does provide. And in that respect, if I was going to give this a rating, like from my content, art, layout, and things like that, I would give this a rating higher than what I gave the Adventurer's Guide. So everything would get a critical success, except for the art. The art is kind of the same. With that being said, feel free to leave a comment down below. Give this video a huge thumbs up to support this series, and I will see you guys in the next video.